Right. Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to wait a couple of moments for a few more people to join in. I need to apologize to anyone who's turned up to this session expecting to hear my talk about my arsenal of development tools for WordPress. Unfortunately, I've been too busy this week to really give it the kind of polish that I wanted to give it, and so I would have been a bit of a rambling, boring talk, I think, so I changed it to my internationalization talk instead, so I hope you don't mind. There'll be plenty that you can learn from it, and I'll have to do my WordPress weaponry talk another time. I think we're ready to go. Brad, if you want to swap my screen over, and we'll get started. Okay, right. So, internationalization for WordPress developers. What I'm going to be talking about in this session is best practices for internationalizing themes and plugins, but some of the concepts that I'll be talking about apply to internationalizing software in general, and it also applies to WordPress core, not just themes and plugins. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Blackbourn. I'm one of the core developers of the WordPress software. I've been working with WordPress for something like 10 years now. It might even be a little bit longer than that. Time does seem to fly pretty quickly. I work as an engineer at HumanMade. We are a WordPress specialist development agency over in the UK, here in the UK. And my particular focuses with regard to the WordPress project are security, internationalization, and accessibility are the areas that I'm really passionate about. If you want to follow me on Twitter, GitHub, WordPress, all of those kind of places, you'll find me at John Billion. So before I start, I'm going to briefly go over terminology. We've got some phrases here that you'll hear quite often and quite a few times through this presentation. So translation, this is the process of taking a piece of text in one language and making it available in another language. So for example, you'll have a piece of text in English and you will translate it and make it available in another language such as German, French, Italian, and so forth. And translation is one part of the process of localization. This is the wider process of adapting a piece of software so that it can be used in different regions or different languages or different locales. And as well as translation, this includes customizations to things like date and time formats, currency, text direction, and even things such as symbols and icons. And internationalization is a process of designing and building a piece of software in a way that enables it to be localized. So in the context of WordPress, this internationalization means using the correct functions in PHP and JavaScript to localize text, and it also means utilizing the translate.wordpress.org platform that I'll talk about more shortly. Now the WordPress, well, the translation community rather, they really like their abbreviations, so you'll see these phrases as T9N, L10N and I18N, and they just represent the first and the last letter and the number of letters between those. So internationalization there has got 18 letters between the first I and last N. So my talk here, internationalization for WordPress developers, could also be called I18N for W7SD8S. So first of all, the WordPress, or the translation system in WordPress, is powered by a platform called translate.wordpress.org. If you go on the settings, the general settings screen in WordPress, you'll see a language switcher at the bottom, and the list of available languages here is powered by the translate.wordpress.org API. And when you change your chosen language, WordPress goes and downloads all of the language files for that language from translate.wordpress.org and installs them locally. Translations for WordPress core and all of the plugins and themes that are available on the WordPress.org directories. All of the translations are provided from translate.wordpress.org, and they're provided by hundreds of people around the world who contribute translations. And this can be done through the translate.wordpress.org interface. Here you'll see an example of some text that is awaiting translation, some which are awaiting approval, and some examples of a right to left text there. If you want to get involved in translating WordPress, you can do that in a polyglots channel in WordPress Slack. If you don't know anything about WordPress Slack, head over to chat.wordpress.org and all of the information is there. So if you want to get started with translating either WordPress itself or any of the plugins or themes, you can jump into the polyglots channel and find out all the information there. And if you want to get involved in building the software itself that powers translate.wordpress.org, which is called GlotPress, you can join the GlotPress channel and you can get involved in that if you'd like to. So before we start looking at any of the code for localization, there's a couple of concepts that you need to bear in mind, and the golden rule is do not concatenate strings together to form sentences. So in English, we're quite lucky. We don't have language constructs such as gender or declension, and it means that constructing a sentence like this by just concatenating things together, it works fine. But these sentences cannot be accurately translated for several reasons. Firstly, of course, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but the post type variable here, of course, this needs to be translated. You can't just translate the word updated because it wouldn't really make much sense. And on the second line here, the number, you can't just go and inject a number into a string because in certain languages, the whole structure of that sentence could change. You know, the number is not necessarily going to be the third word in that sentence in other languages. So the golden rule is say no to concatenation. It doesn't work. Well, it works in English, but it doesn't work. It means that your phrases won't be accurately translatable. So let's have a look and see how we can make our plugin or theme internationalized. There's 3 steps to this. The first one is the double underscore and the underscore E functions in WordPress. Now on this first line here, this is just a regular phrase, hello world. And if we want to internationalize this to make it available for translation in WordPress, all you need to do is wrap it in the double underscore function and append this second parameter called a text domain, which I'll talk about more shortly. And that will mean that that string is now internationalized. It's ready for translation. And when WordPress or your plugin or your theme starts to get popular and people write translations for it, that string will be translatable. The underscore E function is just a helper function. It's just a wrapper for echo double underscore. So instead of returning the string, the translated string, it will echo it out. If you look in the core of WordPress, you'll see these double underscore and underscore E functions all over the place. They're the cornerstone of internationalizing WordPress or WordPress plugin or theme. So what's the second parameter for? This is called the text domain. Its purpose is to tell WordPress where to load the translations for this string from, and it's a unique identifier. If your plugin or theme is hosted on the WordPress.org plugin or theme directories, and this slug needs to match the slug that's used in the URL of your plugin or theme. So where you've got something like wordpress.org/plugins/ and then the name of your plugin, that needs to match that slug there, which means it's unique and it's uniquely identifiable for your plugin or theme. And once you've got some translations for your plugin, they'll go into a directory and they'll look a little bit like this. And here you can see your text domain, which is your unique identifier, followed by a dash, and then the language code for that given language. So this is where your text domain becomes really important. Step 2 of 3 to internationalizing your plugin or theme is to tell WordPress where to load these Mo files from. Now this is a function called load plugin text domain. All we need to do is pass it our text domain parameter, which is the name of our plugin. We don't need to worry about the second parameter here, Boolean false. This is a deprecated parameter. And the third parameter is the absolute path to the directory in your plugin or theme that contains all of your translations. Now, generally, most plugin and theme authors put that in a directory called languages, so you can just copy this text directly and drop that into your plugin or theme. And then that just needs to be wrapped in a function that gets triggered on the init hook. It's pretty much the same for themes, except the function is called load theme text domain. You pass it your text domain parameter, and you pass it the path to the languages directory inside your theme. This one should go on the after setup theme hook. And that means when WordPress loads and your user is using it in a language other than English, WordPress knows where to find the translations for your plugin or theme. It knows which directory to look in for the Mo files. And thirdly, localized headers. So if you have a plugin or a theme on a site which is not being used in English, but the plugin or theme isn't active, then WordPress isn't going to know where to find those Mo files, because the code that we've just seen in the last two slides there won't be executed because the plugin or theme isn't active. So these two extra headers in your plugin header called text domain and domain path provide the same information. It's the text domain, the unique identifier for your plugin or theme, and the relative path to the directory that contains all of your translations. What this means is if someone visits the plugins screen in WordPress or the themes screen in WordPress, depending on if you're writing a plugin or a theme, and your plugin or theme isn't active, then the things like the name and the description, and indeed even your author name, can be translated and displayed in the correct language, even though the plugin or the theme isn't currently active. So this is an important couple of headers to add to your plugin or theme. And it's the same for a theme header here, just the text domain and domain path fields. So these are the three basic steps that you need to do to internationalize your plugin or theme. You need to use the double underscore and underscore e functions to make a regular piece of text localizable. You need to tell WordPress where to load your translation Mo files from, which directory to load them from, and then you need to drop in those two localized headers into your plugin or theme so WordPress can load the translations even when it isn't active. As of WordPress 4.6, which was released just last week, this step 2 is actually technically optional now, because the order in which translations are loaded has been changed. So WordPress will now look for translations that have come from translate.wordpress.org, and they will prioritize those over any translations that are bundled in the plugin or theme. So this step 2 is technically optional now. However, because it was only introduced in WordPress 4.6 just a few days ago, I would not skip that just yet. You'll need to wait until WordPress 4.6 has been out for much longer and more people are using it before you can think about avoiding doing step 2. So that's it really. So now for the rest of my talk, I'm going to expand on a bunch of further considerations that you need to make with regard to making the text in your plugin or theme translatable and making the lives of your translators easier, and indeed making sure that text in your plugin or theme can correctly be translated. The first of those is context. So in English here, we've got two phrases. The word comment in English can be a noun or a verb. Now the problem with this is that in another language such as German or Italian or many other languages, the noun for comment and the verb for comment are actually different. So for example, in Italian you have commento and commentare. The words need to be different. So the underscore x and underscore ex functions in WordPress are available for disambiguating these phrases. So these two functions are the same as your underscore functions, except they include a second parameter here, which is available for you to specify the context. So here we've got the word comment, and I've put some parameter explaining this is a noun, and in the second example there, a comment which explains that it's a verb. And what happens with this is when translate.wordpress.org scans your plugin or theme to look for all of the translatable strings, this context parameter will actually disambiguate these two phrases, and it will mean that the word comment will be available for translation twice, once as a noun, once as a verb. And this means that in any language where those words differ, you will be able to provide two different translations for the same word in English. On a similar note, if you want to make the lives of your translators easier, there's a functionality for this in WordPress where you can put an inline comment immediately preceding a piece of text. It should start with the word translators and a colon, and then a short piece of text which is basically only there to provide translators with an extra little bit of context which helps them more accurately translate that piece of text. So here again we've got the word comments, but on its own that hasn't, that lacks complete context. So in the comment above it, I put list table column header, and you could probably actually expand on that even better to make it really clear to your translators what this piece of text represents. So when should you use a context function, and when should you use a translator comment? Well, _x and _ex, these are used to disambiguate phrases which may be the same in English but could potentially differ in any other language, whereas a translator comment is only there to provide extra context for your translators to make their lives a little easier. And of course, you can use both of these to provide extra accurate translations and extra context for your translators. Now, if we remember back to our first rule where I said concatenation is bad, well, how do we handle a situation where we need to inject a string, one string into another string, but retain its ability to be translated? Well, this doesn't work. You can't just put a variable straight into a string like this. It will technically work in PHP, but the problem is when translate.wordpress.org comes along and scans the text in your plugin, it doesn't actually execute the PHP. It reads it as plain text. So this string will be seen as the literal string by the translator. So the translator will see the opening curly braces, they'll see the $sign, and they'll see the variable name. And of course, it won't be translatable. They won't know what's going on there. We also can't do this. We can't have a piece of text there with hello and then concatenate a variable on it and then try to translate an exclamation mark. I don't even know how you would translate an exclamation mark on its own, because, of course, the structure of this sentence could change completely in another language, especially in a right-to-left language where the punctuation isn't going to appear at the end of the sentence. This is absolutely not translatable. Of course, it lacks the context that puts the whole sentence together. So the solution is to use PHP's sprintf functions. This is a function built into PHP. What we do instead is we have the phrase hello, and we put a placeholder in here. This $s is a placeholder. And then when your translator comes along, they will see this phrase called hello %s, and they will know that this %s is a placeholder for another piece of text. And then at runtime, when your plugin loads, you pass the name parameter into the sprintf function, and in its example, the name is probably the name of the currently logged in user, and it will output the phrase hello and then the user's name. This means that the string is translatable. It's going to work. You can have an accurate translation. This is the way to do it. Now, similarly, when you're working with numbers, you can't just do this. You can't just put a variable into the string. The main problem here, of course, is that the number could potentially vary. It could be a singular form, it could be a plural form. So this sentence not only needs to be translatable, but also needs to vary depending on the value of the number. So let's see how we deal with that. Again, we use the sprintf function in PHP, but WordPress provides this handy function called _n. Now, what this function does is it looks a little bit like the double underscore function, except it takes two parameters. It takes two strings as the first two parameters. The first parameter is the singular form of the phrase, and the second parameter is the plural form of the phrase. Now, what underscore n does is you pass it a third parameter with a number, and underscore n will either return the first or the second parameter based on whether the value of count in this example is singular or plural. And it will also make those strings available for translation. So there'll be two strings here. We've got a %s post for the singular and %s post for the plural. And at runtime, we use this. We pass in the count parameter into printf. And what happens there is the count gets output in place of the placeholder, and the correct string gets output based on whether the values are singular or plural. Now, you'll note that I've avoided using the phrase one here instead of singular, and there's a very important distinction to make between one item and a singular number of items. So in English, the only number that's singular is the number one. But in other languages, for example, in Russian, the numbers 11 and 21 and 31, etc. are also singular. So in Russian, you would say one post and 11 post and 21 post instead of 21 posts. So this means if your string specifically represents one item and one item only, then you actually need to add some logic. And this example here is taken straight from WordPress core. Here we have a simple piece of logic. Deleted. The deleted variable here is the number of themes that have been deleted. Now, if one theme has been deleted and only one, then what we'll do is we'll output the text theme deleted, because this piece of text only applies to one theme. However, if more than one has been deleted, then we need to use the singular and the plural forms correctly. So in Russian, for example, if you delete 11 themes at the same time, it will correctly use the singular form of this phrase, which is the %s placeholder theme deleted. That will be translated correctly in Russian to the singular form. The second sentence here will be correctly translated into the plural form. And that's the logic you need to use. Now, this is not a super common situation. 99% of the time, the singular form and the plural form will work fine. But if you have a situation where you explicitly need to output a piece of text which only represents one item, then you do need to use this piece of logic. So it's something you need to bear in mind. Another situation which may sound like something that is not going to come up very often, but in fact comes up a little more often than you might think, is the situation where you don't know the value of a number at the point where you are introducing the strings for translation. So in this example here, we have a phrase representing image, and in brackets we've got the number of images that represents as the placeholder. We've got the singular and the plural form. But as an example, these labels might be introduced in a helper function. They might not actually occur anywhere near the point where we output those values. So WordPress provides this function called _n_no_op. And what this does is this registers those strings for translation. When translate.wordpress.org comes along and scans your plugins or themes, it will see these strings and it will register them for translation. And then we use this partner function called translate no opt plural. What all this does is this correctly selects either the singular or the plural string based on the value of _n_no_op. And we pass it count, so it knows whether to return the singular or the plural form. And then we'll pass it into our printf function along with the count again, so the actual number that we're interested in gets replaced in the placeholder there. Now, like I said, it doesn't sound like a super common situation, but it does happen. One example where we use this in WordPress core is when the default labels for post types and taxonomies and things are generated, because the labels are generated before the point at which they're actually used in the interface. Another consideration then is punctuation. So in English, the angle quotes, like the right and left angle quotes, are used, or rather they used to be used fairly commonly for to identify navigation. So, for example, the next post and previous post links, it's quite common to see those double angled arrows appended and prepended to that phrase, so it's easy to see whether it's the next or the previous post. However, the right angle quotes and the left angle quotes can actually have a meaning in some languages. For example, in French, they can represent speech marks, nested speech marks. So you can't do this, because what this means is you're going to be outputting a piece of punctuation which actually has a meaning in some languages. So what you should do, instead of prepending a piece of punctuation, you should always include it in the piece of text that is made available for translation. Again, this comes back to not concatenating things together to form a phrase. You should always make a full sentence or a full phrase translatable as a whole, rather than trying to concatenate things together. And of course, even better than this, one step better than this, is to not hard code a quote mark in here at all, and try to use it, try to apply it with CSS instead, so it's not even part of the text. Just like this. Now, one consideration that you might not immediately think of with regard to translations is security. So this very simple looking piece of text here actually potentially has a glaring security vulnerability in it, but looking at it, you probably wouldn't see it. So imagine a situation where somebody sends you a translation for your plugin or your theme, and the translation for this phrase includes a piece of JavaScript that they've dropped in there. What happens is WordPress will happily output that piece of JavaScript. If the script looked like this, if there had a little alert in there, when your user loaded up the page, they would see this alert box pop up saying hello. And of course, your translator could put some much more malicious JavaScript in there, and they could steal your users' cookies, they could redirect people, they could do all sorts of things. So, although this is a mostly theoretical concern, this is something to bear in mind. So WordPress actually provides a bunch of helper functions which escape the output. So this function here called html_e, what this does is it escapes any HTML before it echoes it to the page. So instead of a JavaScript message appearing, the completely safe encoded or HTML entity encoded version of that script tag will be output instead. Now, like I said, this is a mostly theoretical concern, because in fact the translate.wordpress.org translation platform has a whole bunch of safeguards against people putting JavaScript into translations. It's also got safeguards for people accidentally forgetting to close HTML tags, inserting markup that isn't in the original translation, lots of stuff like that. So if your translations are coming from translate.wordpress.org, you can be pretty sure that translations are good, they haven't got JavaScript in, things like that. However, if you're accepting translations for a plugin or a theme that is, maybe it's a private one, it isn't on the WordPress.org directory, or it's the translations are coming from some third-party translation platform, you really need to consider whether you need to protect yourself from some malicious translations. There's a whole bunch of these escape functions in WordPress. We've got the escape attribute version of __, and the escape HTML version, and again the same for _e, so they echo, and _x for numbers and context. We haven't got currently HTML_n, but I believe that's going to appear in WordPress 4.7. So, like I said, this is mostly a theoretical concern. Now, as a personal preference, I've actually chosen to escape all of the translations in all of my plugins and themes. You may consider doing that, of course, but the problem is HTML in strings. Now, this is our example from earlier where we started to put the user's name into the hello message. Now, if we wanted to display the user's name in bold, what we could do is just stick the bold tags in the string here. But this isn't great, and the reason this isn't great is because your translators need to translate this text along with the markup in there. Now, most translators in WordPress do have a basic knowledge of HTML, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily want to translate phrases that include HTML. So a good approach is to, as much as possible, try to avoid putting HTML into strings that get translated. So in this example, a better way of doing this is to remove the bold tags from the translatable string and instead wrap them around the variable at the point in which we insert it through the placeholder system in printf. This is much better. And of course, one step better than this would be to not use the bold tags at all and maybe style it with CSS, although this example, of course, that's not possible. But yeah, a good rule of thumb is, as much as possible, avoid HTML in strings, particularly if you have things such as the opening and closing paragraph tags at the beginning and end of a string. You don't need those to be translated. Remove them from the translatable string, output them at runtime, and it will make the lives of your translators much, much easier. Some internationalization tools are available. So I've been talking a lot about translate.wordpress.org. If you've got a plugin or a theme that isn't available on translate.wordpress.org, for example, if you've written a private plugin or theme for a client, or you're sourcing your translations from elsewhere, you still need to generate all of the strings that are going to be translated in your plugin or your theme. Now, translate.wordpress.org uses these tools, and they're open source. They're available from develop.svn.wordpress.org, and there's a tools directory in there. Tools/i18n. There's a bunch of tools available in there. The sort of primary one is one called MakePot, and what this script does is it scans all of the PHP files in your plugin or theme, and it looks for all of the strings that occur inside the double underscore functions, the underscore e, the underscore x, the underscore n, and so on. And it generates a list of all of those strings along with any translator comments and context that you've added. And it creates a pot file, what we call a pot file. And this is basically just a list of all of those strings. This is a kind of an industry standard file as part of the get text format. And then what you can do with that file is you can send that to your translators, or you can use another hosted translation service, or you can use software such as Poedit, which is very, very popular for translators to use. They can open the pot file in Poedit, and they can then go and add all of their translations. They'll see the English text on the left-hand side and space to add the translations on the right-hand side. They can generate the translations for that and then send the files back to you as Mo files or Po files. And then you can put those in the languages directory in the plugins and themes, in your plugin or theme. So these tools are available, they're all open source. However, of course, you don't need to worry about any of that if you're using the translate.wordpress.org platform, if your plugin or theme is in the WordPress directories, WordPress.org directories. Don't worry about trying to write that horrible subversion URL down. All you need to do is Google for internationalization for WordPress developers. There's a page on the WordPress Codex which has got a whole bunch of information to do with internationalizing your plugins or your themes. So the stuff that I've talked about is on there in detail, along with some more information about date formats and time formats and number formatting. So internationalization for WordPress developers, give that a Google, and the WordPress Codex page will hopefully show up. And the relatively new developer.wordpress.org/plugins resource, which has only recently gone online. This has got a whole bunch of information specifically for internationalizing plugins and more information about how the translate.wordpress.org platform works. So these two pages basically provide all the information you need to internationalize plugins or themes. So once you've got your head around those kind of concepts, you can give your knowledge a bit of a test. The folks over at WordPress.com VIP published a blog post sometime last year with a good multiple choice question test on it to test your knowledge of internationalization. The test, if you give this a Google, WordPress developers test your internationalization knowledge, you'll find their blog post. I think there's 10 questions on there with multiple choice answers. Their questions are things like, which is the best way to internationalize this phrase, and some multiple choice answers, and you can choose your answers, and they'll provide feedback whether you're right or wrong and why certain methods are better than others. So yeah, once you've got more comfortable with internationalizing your plugins or your themes, you should go and do this test and see what score you can get. So that's about it from me. I'm a little bit ahead of time, actually. I think I rattled through that a bit quickly. So we've got tons of time for questions. If you've got any questions about internationalization or how the translate.wordpress.org platform works, or anything else to do with WordPress core internationalization, ask away, and I'll be around for about 15 or 20 minutes, I think. So let's see, have we got any questions? Oh yeah, so we've got some good links that have been posted in the sidebar there. Yeah, Otto, yeah, the link, Zay's link there to Otto's post, Internationalisation, you're probably doing it wrong. That's got some really good examples of where you can mess up internationalisation without realising it. Yeah, Munira, that's the link to Poedit, the software which translators can use to translate strings. I'm going to jump over to AJ here. He's posted a question. Do you think the Englishese of programming is a serious hindrance to the future of WordPress? For example, things like for loop and if then are based on English grammar. Syntaxes like EPL do not require the developer to understand basic English, ultimately opening up programming to massive amounts of people. It's a great point. Of course, the most straightforward answer to that is that this is not a specific problem to WordPress. It's not even a specific problem to PHP. Of course, it's inherent in, I would say, probably 90% of programming languages in the world. You need to have at least some kind of understanding of the syntax, which is usually to some degree based on English phrases. Things like the for loops and if, then, and else. They are based on English phrases. So it's an interesting question, because at some point the sort of the if and the if, else, and else if, they almost become syntax instead of language. And if that was in a language I didn't understand, it was sorry. If I'm trying to read the sidebar at the same time as speaking, that's not going to work. If I was looking at a programming language which used a language other than English, I wouldn't necessarily have to understand that language to understand the programming language, because they're such short phrases. If then could be in a language other than English, I would soon learn it. So it's a great question. I would say maybe it's a little bit more of a problem with, maybe not. I was going to say it may be a little bit more of a problem with JavaScript, but maybe that's not the case. Certainly the big problem is things like inline comments. So of course, all of the inline comments inside the PHP and JavaScript code in WordPress is in English. All of the doc blocks, all the parameter descriptions, all that kind of stuff is in English. There have been some ideas bounced around by the WordPress docs team about how that can be translated. We don't currently have any kind of strong ideas of how we might go about that, but it's certainly something that's been bared in mind. If you go to developer.wordpress.org and look at the various resources on there, there are things such as comments that users can leave to describe the best usage of the various functions and hooks that are in WordPress. And of course, all of those comments are in English as well, because of the primary language that all of these functions are written in is English. Again, translating all of that information would be a great help to people who don't natively speak English to get involved in WordPress development. I don't think there's a straightforward answer to how we can make that easier. It's something that we just do bit by bit to widen the amount of people who can contribute to WordPress and write plugins and things without necessarily having to have a good grasp of English. Yeah, good question there, AJ, thanks. So there was a question from Rohan, how to handle third-party plugins which are not ready for translation. So if you, so I presume, Rohan, now you're talking about a situation maybe where you're building a website and you're using some plugins from third parties and they haven't made the strings in the plugin available for translation. Unfortunately, there's not really much you would be able to do in that situation, other than try to contact the plugin developer and say, hey, the text in your plugin or theme isn't internationalized, which means it can't be translated, and send them the documentation, send links to the documentation I mentioned at the end of the talk there, and try to encourage them, try to explain to them that if they make the strings in their plugin or theme internationalized, then of course they'll have a much wider audience for that plugin or theme once they start to get translations. If it's a plugin that you had, like if it's a bespoke plugin that you had developed specifically for a site, then I would say that you would be best off trying to go back to the developers and say, hey, this really should be internationalized, and come to some agreement about making sure that all the work going forward is ready for translation and not just, you know, specific to English. But from a technical point of view, there's nothing that you can do about that. Unfortunately, you can't translate a plugin or a theme that has just got English text in it being output as regular PHP or HTML. It needs to be wrapped in the underscore functions that I've mentioned in my talk. Yeah. Great, yeah, good weaponry. Have we got any more questions coming up? Let's have a look. I think that might be the only one. Okay. Well, as soon as we've got a little bit of time left, I'll briefly mention two other functions that I was reminded of a while ago that aren't in my talk. Unfortunately, you'll have to visualize them in your brain. So the two functions that I didn't get to cover in this talk are related to dates and number formatting. Actually, if I switch over, do this, you can all see that, can't you? Yep. So in WordPress settings screen here, there's a setting for the date format and the time format. You'll see there's a few examples here, such as August 20, 2016, and these different date formats. Now, these are output using the PHP function called date, which is, give that a Google, just regular PHP date function. Now, the problem here is that this is going to output English phrases. So the word Sunday, Saturday, you know, January, December, it's only going to output the English phrases. So in WordPress, we've got a function called date_i18n. Let's give that a Google, see if it comes up. Yeah, here we are. WordPress date i18n. Here, you can all see that. And all this is a wrapper for the PHP date function. The difference is that it will localize its output depending on the language that's being used on the site. So, for example, if you output this string here, which includes the name of the month in full, then if someone's using this in a language other than English, actually I can switch this over right now. Let's have a look at French. Give this a moment. And you'll see down here that we have the French name for August. And that is because we're using, on that particular example, we're using the function date_i18n. Works exactly the same as the date function in PHP. It takes the same parameters, except it localizes the output to the language that's in use. And we also have the same thing for numbers. So in PHP, where you would use a function called number format, WordPress has a version called number format i18n. So what the number format function does is it takes a number and it formats it using decimal points and thousand separators, things like that. Now, where is there an example in WordPress? I would say probably haven't. Well, so the number over here where you've got like the number of posts. So if this number went over 1,000, we would get a comma in there as 1,000 separator. Now in French, actually, there's an example up the top here in my Query Monitor plugin. So in French, the decimal point is actually a comma, it's not a full stop. So in PHP, if you use a number format function, it's not going to format according to the current language. You're going to need to use the WordPress version of this function called number format I18N. And again, it takes some parameters, it takes the number and it takes the decimals. I think it actually, the number and the number of decimals that you want to output, and it localizes that number according to the current locale. So in this example, we've got commas showing up as the decimal points, which is correct for French. If you've got some decimal points in there, it would correctly show up, and thousand separators, things like that. So those are two functions that unfortunately I didn't cover properly in my talk. I'll probably add them the next time I do this talk. So yeah, date I18N in place of date, and number format I18N in place of number format. Those are two other functions that you should use. Okay, so unless there's any other questions from anyone, which it doesn't look like there is, I think I will wrap it up there. Let's see what Brad says in Slack. Yeah, okay, right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully those of you who turned up for my developer weaponry talk weren't too disappointed. Right, see you all soon.